On a previous screencast, I explained a little bit about what parenthetical documentation is and what students are going to be expected to know, and kind of just a quick overview. So the screencast that I'm going to continue trying to do will be the practices that we've done in class in case students are absent or need to review it. They could print off the works cited again and try it. So hopefully this will help, because I do understand that this is the first time students are using these and they can be very confusing. There's just a lot of information. But again, some of it is common sense, and it's a matter of paying attention and slowing down and just following directions. So today, students got their first sample that they were going to try, and at the top they had a works cited page with 5 sources. And what we did first was go through and review what type of a source each one was. The bottom half of the student document looks like this, and this is where they actually will write the type of source and all the information that I'm going to be typing on here. But I did this in red so that when I type you can kind of see what students are supposed to be doing. And again, we did this all together in class. Whatever I typed on the board, they were supposed to be writing at their seat on their paper. So the first thing we did was figure out how many sources there were, and then we looked at each information in each source and decided what it was. So the first one says Art of the Renaissance, New York, Bantam 1985 print. And in looking at that information, we can tell, or we determined, that this was a book, a printed book, but there was no author listed for it. And that's going to be a little important later on when we get to actually citing information from this source. The second source was Art of the Renaissance World Book Student. We've used World Book Student on previous research projects this year already, and we call those reference sources. This is an article from a reference source online. And again, we have no author. And we kind of reviewed just quickly what these dates and things mean. The 2011 after World Book tells us the publication date for World Book. And then 31 March 2011 tells when the last when me as the researcher, when I last visited the website and checked out the information. All right, so the next one, Hall Jane, Harlem Renaissance, A Cultural Rebirth, Cobblestone, April 2006, 3 through 7, EBSCOhost. And this is the first time we've actually used EBSCOhost, and I tried to explain kind of what EBSCOhost does. It is an online resource, but it's not really a reference source, and it's not a website. I kind of compared it to a bank. A bank is a place where you take your money and they hold it for you. They didn't do the work for the money. They didn't make the money. They're just holding the money for you. And that's kind of what EBSCOhost does. It's a database, and it holds a bunch of articles from magazines and newspapers and other research places so that it's all in one place and easy to access. It would be absolutely impossible to have every single copy of every single magazine published, every newspaper, every version of it that had ever been published. So EBSCOhost has set up a database, and they hold all that information. They didn't write the articles, they didn't publish the articles, they just hold it for us. And it's a wonderful, wonderful resource, because we don't have to worry about having the print resources or the print copy in front of us anymore. And so we could tell that this was an article from a magazine, and students really didn't recognize that Cobblestone was a magazine. I knew it, but our hints were that it was from April 2006, and we know that magazines are published monthly or bi-monthly sometimes. And the other clue here is that there are page numbers. Okay, so it's an article from a magazine, and we did have one author. The next source is Hankins James Renaissance World Book Student. Again, we've got an article from a reference source. Same thing. The only difference this time is that we do have an author. And then the last one, Wilson Calvin, Ailey Company Steps to New Heights at the Fox, St. Louis Post Dispatch. And we see this EBSCO host again, which tells us that we're looking at, oh, and I should probably put that up here, that it was published in a database. So we've got this database again. It's not a magazine this time. Post Dispatch sounds like it's a newspaper. Article from a newspaper. And another hint to the fact that it's a newspaper is that its publication date is 14th of March 2011. And so we know that newspapers are published on a daily basis. And we do have a one author for this. And again, it's from a database. Now normally, because it's a newspaper, we would see page numbers like A5 or C3, but this one actually indicates that there are no pages listed, so we can't really worry about that. So we've gone through, we figured out the type of source that we have, and any information that we think is going to be important. So the next part is to circle the words and page numbers if needed that we're going to use for parenthetical documentation. So I used a highlighter, and if students wanted to, they could use a highlighter. And again, their works cited didn't have all this writing up here, so that it was a little bit cleaner, hopefully, for them to look at. But in looking at the first source, it was a book with no author. And so if we have an author, we always want to give reference to that author, but we didn't. So we're going to use the title of the book, Art of the Renaissance. And since it's a book, we know that we're going to have to indicate at some point a page number, because no teacher is going to read every single book that every student brings in for research. The student needs to indicate that the fact that they found was on a certain page, and then if the teacher wants to go back and find that information, she can refer back to this source, and she could find it at the library, look on whatever page is indicated to verify that that fact is true. The second source was an article from a reference source, and again, we did not have an author, so we're going to use the title of the book or the article. This time, though, we've got the same title. So how do we know which one we're looking at when we look at parenthetical documentation? So, since it's a book title, we have to show that it's a book by underlining it. If we were typing it, we could italicize it the way it is shown here, but when we're handwriting, we'll have to underline it. And this one has quotation marks in it, so when we go to recopy it, we've got to make sure that we put those quotation marks in it as well, and that indicates that it's a smaller work, a chapter, or an article. And we want to make sure always that we're capitalizing and punctuating and spelling everything the way that we see it. Since this is an online source, we do not need to use page numbers. The next source was an article from a magazine with one author. That makes it a lot easier for us. We can just use the author's last name. And we did have page numbers for this one, because if the teacher did want to go back and track down that actual printed copy, this is where she would need to find the information. So we do need to indicate those page numbers when we write about it later. The next source is an article reference. We do have an author. Again, makes it much easier. We're going to use the author's last name, and we do not need page numbers for this source. And then our last one was an article from a newspaper. We did have an author, so we can use his last name. Normally we would use page numbers, but there are none indicated here, so we don't have to. So once we've gone through this process, we're still not done, because now we're going to pretend that we actually did a research project about art during the Renaissance. And so students, we just kind of made up a silly paragraph pretending that we actually did the research. I was not concerned with the quality of the writing at this point. We were really looking at how do we put parenthetical in. So students on the back of their paper had to write a paragraph. So we just started with a sentence about art. Art is fun. And again, we would evaluate, is this a fact from research? And it did. It came from my first source, Art of the Renaissance. And I need to make up a pretend page number. It came from page 2 in that book when I was researching. So I'm going to put Art of the Art is Fun, and we had talked about that we needed to underline the title, Art of the Renaissance. And I came on page 2. We don't put page number or a comma or PG or anything in the parentheses. The only thing that that number is going to represent is a page number. So we don't need to put anything else in there. Just the title of the book and the page number. And our sentence is not complete until we've put in that parenthetical to prove that our fact came from research. So the period is always going to go on the outside of the parenthesis. So then we made up another sentence about art. We said there are 3 primary colors. And we're going to pretend that this fact came from our second source, which is also titled the same as our first source, but we knew that it was a shorter work. It was just an article instead of a book. So when we recopy it, we need to make sure we include those quotation marks. Art of the Renaissance. Otherwise, our teacher won't know which source it is that we're looking at. So we put our beginning quote, our end quote, our period goes on the outside, and we had already indicated over here that we did not need a page number. So now we need another sentence. 2 primary colors can make a secondary color. And another thing I wanted to emphasize with students is that we're not writing just a list of facts. We're kind of trying to tie this together like we normally would if we were writing a research paper. And so we're paragraphing, we're indenting, we're using our space on the page. We're not just writing a sentence on one line and then going to the next line and writing a sentence. It's going to flow like a paragraph. Okay, so we're going to pretend that this fact came from this source. We're going to go back to our works cited and look at what did we highlight. Hall and the page numbers. So I'm going to put Hall, and again this is so much easier when we actually have authors instead of just titles of things. Okay, Hall 3 through 7. I don't need to underline the author's name or quote the author's name, and I try to compare that to the kids that you don't quote or underline your name. It just needs to be capitalized. And again, we're not putting a comma or a PG or the number sign in there. We're just putting the page numbers. A color wheel shows complementary colors. And I'm pretending that this fact came from my fourth source, and I look at what I had highlighted or circled, and it's just the author's last name, Hankins. There was no page number, so I put my end parenthesis, period. And then I need one final sentence about art. Art uses different medium. And so I go back to my article or my works cited page, look at what I had highlighted, just the author's last name. I'm going to put Wilson, end parenthesis, and my period. And so by looking at this, as the teacher, I can figure out that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different facts that came from research. And these would be things that students actually had to find in a book or a website that added to their knowledge of whatever it is that they're studying. And so this is kind of what we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. I would encourage students to practice this again at home if they want to, if they wanted to try doing it on their own, and then they could watch this to check and review their answers. I encourage that because this is a very, very difficult concept. And so this is the practice that we did on Tuesday in class.